Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this public briefing, Beyond the Headlines. As China and India age, young Africa has the potential to power the global workforce. I am Marlene Lee, Associate Vice President at the Population Reference Bureau and the webinar moderator today. Before our main event, let me give you a brief orientation to the webinar controls. For presentations, all microphones but the speakers are muted. You will see on the bottom of your screen Q&A. You may click and enter questions about the webinar at any time. Please include your affiliation with your question. I will be monitoring this space. If you do not see Q&A, look for 3 dots and click on those. Then the Q&A should appear. For technical difficulties, please raise your hand electronically, and Walker Irving will reach out to you to help resolve the issue, any issues. Okay, diving right in. Again, welcome and thank you for joining us today at this public briefing, Beyond the Headlines. As China and India age, young Africa has the potential to power the global workforce. Again, for those of you who just joined, I'm Marlene Lee, your moderator. Let me briefly introduce our speakers, PRB, and an outline of today's session before our presentation begins. Our speakers today are Barbara Seligman. Barbara is Senior Vice President responsible for leading international programs at PRB. She has advised development partners and governments in low and middle income countries on developing population and reproductive health policies for more than 30 years. Aissata Fall is Africa Director and West and Central Africa Representative at PRB. She's based in Dakar, Senegal. Aissata has worked on policy dialogue in social protection, access to basic social services, and decentralization for international development agencies and African governments for more than 30 years. For those of you not familiar with PRB or Population Reference Bureau, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that harnesses the power of population data to inform and advance solutions to the most urgent challenges facing our world. We analyze and disseminate information so that it can be used to inform decisions that improve lives. As part of our work, we train researchers, journalists, advocates, and others around the world to use information in support of decision-making. Now, without delay, we will move to our main event. Barbara Seligman will speak on projected changes in the global working age population over the next 30 years, focusing on China, India, and sub-Saharan Africa. Then Aissata Fall will speak on measures African governments are taking to prepare for a demographic dividend. A moderated question and answer session will follow. And I thank you all for putting all this wonderful information about yourselves in the chat. Barbara, welcome.
Thank you very much, Marlene, and welcome to all of you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. I know that many of you are enthusiasts about population matters, and the last couple of months have been really exciting times because so much attention has focused on population issues, notably the fact that India has surpassed China as the most populous country in the world. One of the things that we're going to focus on today are some of the notable demographic changes that are projected to occur over the next 30 years that are more overlooked, that are not talked about so much. And we at PRB have had the good fortune to speak to a number of reporters who've been covering the India population story and to help them see some of these other changes. And we look forward to hearing from you in the discussion about some of your observations about all of this press coverage about the changing composition of the global working age population. So to start, while India is following China's path to become the most populous country in the world, it's also following China's path to become an aged society. By the mid-2050s, India's population, 65 and older, will double from its current level of 7% to 14%. It will take 26 years to experience that doubling. China, which just crossed that threshold, the 14% threshold, took 23 years to make that transition. So India is following behind China's path to become an Asian society, and is doing so a little bit more gradually and with a lag of about 25 years. Sub-Saharan African countries are already driving growth of the global working age population. That is the population between the ages of 15 and 64. While no single African country, of course, can match India in terms of its contribution to the growth of the global working age population, those 50 or so countries together already account for a greater share of the growth in the global working age population today than India. And as India and China's contributions to the growth of the global working age population decline, sub-Saharan Africa's will continue to rise. And when we look at the picture at mid-century, we really see the dominance of sub-Saharan Africa in terms of its contribution to this productive age cohort. And last but not least, we find that it's very important to look closely at young Africans when we talk about the future working age population. The characteristics of those entrants to the working age population, those who are 15 to 19 years old, can be strikingly different from the characteristics of young Africans entering the working age population as recently as 20 years ago, and certainly compared to 30 or even 40 years ago. So let's take a look at the aggregate numbers. And here, what we're showing is the total global working age population, 15 to 64, from 1970 projected through 2050. And we're looking at India, China, and the region of sub-Saharan Africa, again, those 50 or so countries. We include the United States here for comparison, because a number of members of our audience are in the US, and it helps to show that the US is sort of small fry when we're talking about these numbers. So here in 2023, China continues to have to account for more members of the working age population at this moment in time. Back in 2015, China crossed the threshold where its working age population numbered 1 billion. India is going to cross that same threshold sometime later this decade, so between 2025 and 2030. Sub-Saharan Africa is going to cross that threshold another 15 years or so from now, so between 2035 and 2040. By the time we get to the end of this decade, India will have a larger working age population than China. By the time we get to mid-century, sub-Saharan Africa's working age population will be larger than India's. These are the aggregate, the total numbers, but they help to set the stage. Now let's take a look at where the growth in the global working age population is coming from. And again, here we have the same 3 countries plus the region of sub-Saharan Africa for comparison. So if we look at China, China's at the beginning of this century, it's hard to believe, at the beginning of this century, China was, if not the largest, one of nearly the largest contributor to the growth of the global working age population. But its contribution began to decline in the early 2000s. Now with India, India's contribution to the growth of the global working age population has just peaked. And by the time we get to mid-century, India's contribution to that growth is going to come to close to zero. And as I said, when we look at sub-Saharan Africa in 2023, we see that collectively those countries are already contributing a greater share of the growth in the global working age population than India. But the real story is what happens as we move out towards the mid-century mark. And in fact, by the time we get to 2050, if I were to write the headline for this slide, it would say, today in 2050, Nigeria accounts for a quarter of the growth in the global working age population. So over a relatively short period of time, we're going to see some pretty tremendous changes that maybe are not so appreciated as so much attention focuses on what's happening between India and China. So behind the growth of the working age population, we have fertility. That's really what the driver is of this growth. So let's take a few minutes to look closely at what's happening with fertility in India, China, and in sub-Saharan Africa. So we see in China, fertility decline began in the 70s. It was accelerated. You see the steep drop in fertility. It was accelerated by the one-child policy. And really, since 1990, fertility has been at replacement or below replacement levels. Now, replacement fertility, 2.1 children per woman, represents the fertility rate that will kind of keep a population stable. Now, when we look at India, we see that fertility has declined much more gradually. According to the 2019-2021 Demographic and Health Survey, fertility in India is 2.0, so just below replacement levels. And that's quite an accomplishment. India is a very diverse country, great diversity across its different states. One of the things that's very interesting to observe is that the states that historically have had higher fertility have in recent years seen that fertility decline. Even the state of Bihar, India's most populous, has a total fertility rate of 3. Its relatively higher fertility is offset by the fact that so many states in India have below replacement fertility rates or are quite close to replacement. We therefore are confident that as we move towards mid-century, India's fertility rate will stabilize at a place a little bit below replacement levels. There's been a lot of news coverage, many of you are aware of efforts by China and other countries to try to encourage women to have children, and we don't think that those efforts are really going to have much of an impact on these macro level projections for fertility in China, or for that matter in India. Now, looking at sub-Saharan Africa, we're seeing, we project a steady fertility decline, but even by the time we got to 2050, we think that the fertility rate will still be above replacement, which means that the working age population in sub-Saharan Africa will continue to grow as we move into the second half of the century. So fertility rate is directly tied to the size of the working age entrant population, those 15 to 19-year-olds. So even as fertility declines, we have a bit of a lag before we start to see the decline in the age of that 15 to 19-year-old cohort. And you see that here in China, where the decline in the 15 to 19-year-old population began around 2005, despite fertility reaching replacement levels earlier. In India, we see that decline in the 15 to 19-year-old population cohort beginning around 2020, 2023, right around now. And in sub-Saharan Africa, we don't see that decline because, as I said, our projections through mid-century show that fertility continues to stay above replacement level. So what you see with the projected growth of the population cohort, those entrants, 15 to 19 years old, is they continue to grow significantly. And some of the extra growth that you're seeing here is that even though fertility is trending downwards, we have, at least for the course of a generation, more and more women who are having children than ever before. So it takes a little bit of time for the fertility, for those momentum effects to be captured. So let's take a look at trends in the number of working age entrants over this projection period. And I think this is a really striking graph that I think maybe not so many people are aware of. Indeed, by the time we get to 2050, when we look at those new entrants into the workforce, we're going to see India contributing some number that's about 110 million, with sub-Saharan Africa producing or accounting for not quite twice that number. It's a staggering difference and will have really important implications for the global working age population. Up until now, I have talked about sub-Saharan Africa as a region consisting of approximately 50 countries. I want to briefly look at the 3 African countries that are driving the growth in sub-Saharan Africa's population. Those are the 3 most populous ones: Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the DRC, and Ethiopia. And as you see here, I think the principal takeaway is that at the beginning of this century, in 2000, Nigerians, Congolese, and Ethiopians accounted for a pretty small share of the working age population. By the time we get to 2050, and in this case, we're projecting out till 2065, it's a very, very different story. Now, of course, other countries in sub-Saharan Africa together account for the difference that's shown in gray. But none of those other countries individually contributes as much as these 3. So now let's take a look at some of the characteristics of working age populations from these countries that have been driving the growth of the global working age population since the beginning of the 21st century. And if we look at female literacy, it's sort of a crude indicator of the women's status, we see that today female literacy in China is virtually universal, and female literacy rates have been high for a long time. China really stands apart from the other countries in that regard. There's some really good news here. Something that personally was somewhat surprising to me was to just see how much progress the Democratic Republic of Congo has made in improving its female literacy rates, to the point where they're substantially higher than female literacy in India. And in India, there's been much coverage of the fact that the status of women in many Indian states lags significantly, and that has the potential to really mean that the economic gains that are propelled through the demographic transition are not necessarily going to look like they did for China. And then we look at Nigeria and Ethiopia, which perform on this indicator more poorly than India. Remember, here we are looking at ages 15 and over. That'll be important when we come to our next slide. If we take a look at an economic measure, and here we choose to look at gross national income per capita, again, China is in a category by itself, far wealthier than any of the other countries that we're looking at. India and Nigeria are wealthier than the other 2 countries. think it's worth mentioning that the Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the world's poorer countries. So the composition of the working age population, the countries from which the working age population are coming that will dominate the size of the growth of the working age population at mid-century, their characteristics are going to look different than they did at the beginning of this century, and certainly before then. Many of you who are in this audience are academics or students of population, and you know better than I how important it is to look beyond averages. And that averages can mask important trends, and they can mask real stories. And here, again, we want to implore you to look at young Africans and to take a look at some of the changes that are happening in human capital formation, that is, in education, health, job experience among these young cohorts of Africans who are entering the working age population today and in the foreseeable future. When we look at female literacy rates, yeah, Ethiopia didn't look so good when we looked at the average for women 15 and over. But my goodness, look at the progress that's taken place in female literacy in Ethiopia over the course of the last 20 years. Similar gains in DRC, also more modest gains in Nigeria. But what we're seeing is that the young Africans today really look different than they did even a generation ago in terms of their human capital. We see that with life expectancy too. Ethiopia's investments in health in particular are maybe known to many of you, and they really are sort of captured in what we see here as life expectancy gains at age 15. The story with Nigeria, I know somebody's going to ask a question about it. We're still trying to figure out and have asked some people to see if they can help us understand what's going on there. And then finally, adolescent fertility, which signifies trends in early marriage, investments or girls' secondary school attendance. It sort of speaks for a number of different indicators. And again, over the course of the last 30 years, staggering improvement in Ethiopia, really staggering drop in teen fertility rates, adolescent fertility rates, important declines in DRC and in Nigeria as well. So as we look ahead to the future of the global working age labor force, let me just recap some of the things that we've talked about. The demographic dominance of the global working age population has changed over time. Indeed, it's changed over this century, from China to India and soon to the sub-Saharan Africa region. As the United States, Europe, and other high-income countries age, they will need to look beyond their own populations to meet their economic and social needs, among which includes caring for ever-growing populations of older adults. Countries with young populations and relatively high fertility, such as those in sub-Saharan Africa, such as the three that we've mentioned, could contribute to meeting demand for labor and other social and economic needs. And on that note, I will turn the mic over to my colleague, the esteemed Isata Fall, PRB's Director for Africa, who will be talking about some of the measures that African governments are putting in place to prepare for sub-Saharan Africa's dominance in the global labor force. So over to you, Isata.
Thank you, Barbara. Sorry for the camera, but I'm on the phone. So we saw today that if we look at sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, its demographic dynamic is dominated by Ethiopia, DRC, and Nigeria. However, to understand how African leaders are prioritizing investment in the future working age population, it is critical to think about these leads within their respective geographical, economic, and political contexts. These three countries are part of the African Union, which is composed of 55 member states of Africa, its primary role is to promote unity, integration, and cooperation among African countries to advance the continent's socioeconomic development, peace, and security. The Africa Union is made up of 5 regions, as you can see, Northwest, Central, East, and South. And there is a 6th region, an interesting one, the diaspora, which is defined by Africa Union as people of African origin living outside the continent, irrespective of their citizenship and nationality, which is an important aspect. Regional and continental integration is crucial in the African Union agenda because it fosters unity and solidarity among African nations, so they can collectively address common challenges and pursue shared goals. Integration then aims to strengthen Africa's position in the global arena, allowing it to negotiate and engage on equal footing with other regions of the world. Alongside these 6 regions, Africa's regional economic communities, known as the RECs, such as the Economic Community and West African States, known as ECOWAS, are a vital component of the continent's integration efforts. They are building blocks of the African Union and facilitate economic integration between members of the region and through the wider African economic community. Each of Africa's regions has its own dynamics, especially when it comes to demographic. For example, a citizen from one of the West Africa region's 15 countries like Nigeria can travel to another country within the region with a simple ID card, thanks to ECOWAS, the regional economic community. And despite being in a region dominated by the French language, Nigeria people travel a lot within the region to find a job. In another example, a Senegalese citizen can be hired as a staff in the government of Benin's administration. Such free movement of people do not exist in the Central Africa region, which includes the DRC. While the Africa region also has an economic community, people there need a visa, therefore a passport, to travel between countries. And the difference of the cost of a passport compared to a simple ID here shapes access to educational opportunities and also to labor markets, and especially for young people. Then, as we reflect about the working age population and the drivers for a successful workforce in the future, we must think beyond countries' border. In Africa, the future of the workforce is embedded in a continental way of thinking and is framed by countries' commitment and also implemented with consideration for different regional and country contexts. Slide, please. In 2013, you should click, Barbara. In 2013, all 15 member states of the African Union adopted the Agenda 2063, named the Africa We Want. This is a strategic framework for the socioeconomic transformation of the African continent by the year 2063. It outlines key goals and aspirations for Africa's development. And I want to mention here the first 2 aspirations related to our topic today. The first one is for a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development that aims to achieve high levels of economic growth, job creation, and sustainable development across the continent, ensuring that the benefits are shared by all African people. One way the African Union is aiming to accomplish this goal is through the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is intended to create a single market for goods and services across the continent. It has the potential to bring substantial benefits to small-scale businesses and to women, and ultimately to spur job creation across various sectors. The second aspiration of Agenda 2063 is for an integrated continent, politically united and based on the ideals of Pan-Africanism, which seeks to achieve a politically united Africa, to promote peace, stability, and good governance, and also to strengthen continental integration. Here, the African Passport Initiative is intended to facilitate the free movement of people across the continent by introducing a common passport for African citizens. Several countries like Benin, Senegal, Rwanda, and Madagascar are already offering visa-free access or visa on arrival for African people. This freedom of movement can really unlock new opportunities for the transfer of skills, for knowledge, and also labor, while supporting economic growth and development. Then we see that the African Union Agenda 2063 sets out the long-term vision and aspiration for Africa's development across various sectors and provide a comprehensive framework for Africa's overall transformation and progress. It recognizes the youth population and gender equality as key drivers of Africa's future development. And since 2013, during the last decade, the African Union and its member states have been setting the path with new strategies, plans, and tools to achieve the agenda's goals. And the African Union roadmap on harnessing the demographic dividend is one of these strategies. This was signed by all state members in 2017, and it specifically focuses on strategies and action to leverage the potential of Africa's youth population for economic growth and development. The roadmap provides a targeted and specific plan to address challenges and opportunities associated with the demographic dividend, which is a particular emphasis on youth-focused policies and investment. Then, given the significant share of the young people, thinking about the working age population in sub-Saharan Africa means thinking about the demographic dividend, which refers to the accelerated economic growth that can result when more of the country population is of working age and employed in well-paying jobs than it's too young or too old to work. The African Union's demographic dividend roadmap focuses on several key areas, including, among other things, education and skills development, employment and entrepreneurship, and gender equality and empowerment. Regional integration and free movement of people, aims of both the AU roadmap and the Agenda 2063, would remove barriers and create an enabling environment for youth to travel across borders, to access educational opportunities, employment, and entrepreneurship, as they can access larger markets and expand their businesses beyond national boundaries. Through the roadmap support for small and medium-sized enterprise and steps to ease access to finances and markets, it can also foster an environment that enables young people to start and grow businesses, thereby creating employment opportunities. And when it comes to gender, the demographic dividend roadmap acknowledges that gender equality is not only a matter of justice, of social justice, but it is also an essential driver of economic development. The roadmap aims to ensure that women have equal access to education, economic opportunities, and leadership roles. And with its emphasis on girls' education, this roadmap acknowledges that educated girls are more likely to become economically productive adults. Then, both Agenda 2063 and the demographic dividend roadmap work together to guide African countries and decision makers in implementing gender-sensitive and youth-centered policies and programs that help achieve sustainable economic growth and maximize the demographic dividend. Slide, please. To implement the African Union's roadmap and realize the age structure transformation needed to obtain a demographic dividend, countries must apply appropriate policies, frameworks, and funding, as well as measure and monitor their progress. Different methods and tools have been developed to help inform policy decisions based on a deep understanding of their potential, opportunities, and challenges, while also considering youth and gender equality aspects, especially to understand their country's population age structure regarding demographic economics, define their current potential for economic transformation, and also use evidence on effective budget allocations as a main instrument for economic-based decision. Achieving the Agenda 2063's ambitious goals and implementing the demographic dividend roadmap requires changing our mindset. It requires considering the different drivers of success for a strong and productive working age population within the context of their interrelationships. And for example, to do so, some monitoring tools that systematically integrate youth and gender aspects are being institutionalized, sorry for my English, to monitor 5 critical dimensions using standard indicators agreed by experts at country and continental levels regarding economic dependency, quality of life, poverty transition, human capital, but also networks and territories. This process of standard and tools used by all countries is a significant step forward because the indicators are defined collectively and enable more appropriate policies to be adopted. The progress lies in the definition by African countries by themselves of the results to be achieved and the path to follow, anchoring a new way of evidence-based governance principles for the younger generation. And this new way is critical for sustainable policy change and also supports one of the important agendas, Agenda 2063's aspiration of empowering women and youth, ensuring their active participation in decision-making process and their inclusion in the development agenda. Slide, please. So, what does all this mean for Africa and for its future working age population? Actually, it is a combination of good news and challenges still need to be addressed. Agenda 2063 is a new way of thinking about development in Africa with its focus on integration, youth involvement, and gender equality as drivers for economic growth. And this approach is a positive development needed to help countries and regions give more comprehensive consideration to their populations. While gaps still exist, decision makers in African countries are putting new focus on data on youth and gender and their economic decision making. We see this emphasis in both Agenda 2063 and the demographic dividend roadmap, as well as in countries' policies and commitments, but also in the new kind of tools and methods they are using to analyze their situation and inform their policy-making process. As we look to the future, we must pay attention to what is happening today. Youth employment is an urgent problem in the world continent. It is exacting high economic, social, and political costs now and needs creative solutions. The means to some of these solutions are through partnerships between African researchers, decision makers, and organizations like the Regional Consortium for Research in Generational Economy in Senegal, known as CREG, which helps link scientific research to decision making. Organizations like PRB can also help countries develop forecasting, look at how a potential demographic dividend could be amplified through increased gender and youth analysis, and communicate evidence for policy decision-making. Africa today and in the future has a lot to offer, and at PRB, we will continue to follow the evidence and act in close collaboration with our local partners to support countries achieving their potential. Thank you. Marlene, I give you the floor now.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara and Aissata, for giving a closer look at the geographic shift in the concentration of the global working age population, at the prominence of sub-Saharan Africa's young population, and the policy context within Africa. Truly, continued local and international commitment to African countries' actions to prepare their working age populations and to create an enabling environment for job creation is an investment in shaping a global workforce for the future. Now I'm going to turn to some wonderful questions from our participants. We have participants from Ghana, India, Philippines, Canada, Ethiopia, Nepal, Slovenia, Nigeria, Washington, DC, and more. And we have research professors, geography teachers, government staff, longtime PRB followers, journalists, and more. So I hope you are up to the challenge of these questions. Barbara, we will start with you. Let me read a couple of related questions for you. From Suleiman Willie Balde, why is the life expectancy for Nigeria the same level? I would have expected it to rise. I don't think this is good if there are improvements on health and development. From Wonwosen Tekle Selassie. I think young people's skills rather than their numbers will influence the global economy. And from Abewa Wolde Kiros, he wonder what the source of data is. The life expectancy for Ethiopia was not 54 in 2021. It's much more than this. So if you could answer briefly, I think these are related questions. You're muted, Barbara.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your questions. And again, I'm so flattered that so many of you from so many different corners of the world have joined us this morning. Suleiman, as I mentioned, we too are perplexed by the Nigeria numbers, and I've actually put out a request. Unfortunately, I didn't get an answer in time for this presentation. I want to make clear, though, that we're looking at life expectancy at age 15. So life expectancy at birth in Nigeria, of course, has increased, importantly because of those big gains in child survival. But we're still puzzling over why the life expectancy level stays flat over this 30-year period when we look at life expectancy at age 15. And any ideas you might have, sources that you might be able to put us in touch with to help understand what's going on there would be most appreciated. And then Mr. Selassie, I couldn't agree with you more. The numbers are a very crude measure. And one of the things that we've really tried to be careful about is that in the first part of the presentation, we're really talking about the size of the global working age population. And the size of the global working age population, of course, is not the same as the global workforce. And the point that you make about the skills is part of that translation between numbers and productive engagement in the global workforce. So thank you for pointing that out. With respect to life expectancy in Ethiopia, I am not able to look at that slide right now, but I believe if the source is not listed there, I will make sure to get back to you with that source. And if there's something that we have misunderstood, or there's something about that source that we should know that that means that we shouldn't use it, I would be very grateful to have that information and follow that up offline. Over.
Barbara, I just want to clarify that perhaps there's a misunderstanding. Our life expectancy numbers that we gave were life expectancy at age 15, not life expectancy at birth. So
thank you very much,
yeah.
Marlene. Yes, I talked about that in the context of Nigeria, but yes, that is true for all of the countries. So we really wanted to focus on measures of well-being for those who are working, who are entering the workforce, people who are between the ages of 15 to 19, which is why we didn't use life expectancy at birth. Over.
Thank you. Aisata, I'm going to try to read this comment and question slowly. This is from Margaret Walton Roberts. If Africa is being demographically positioned to provide labor to the global economy, what does this mean for health systems? Healthcare workers from Africa are already significant in OECD countries, but the issue of mutual benefits for African sending countries is not well addressed at the current time. What further policy frameworks are needed from WHO and African regional blocs to safeguard health systems in Africa in light of the increasing role of Africa in health and care labor migration?
Thank you, Marlene, and thank you, Margaret, for this question, which is a great one and a topic we are starting to work on with Craig, especially. I would, how can I say that? I would frame this question more in the broader issue about care economy and what it means globally and for Africa. So some frameworks are, or some topics are discussed, especially, for example, around elderly long-term care. And WHO has a lot about that. And what I can tell you is that at country levels or at regional levels, the conversation about care, caregivers, the cost of domestic care, which encompass taking care of the family or being able to take care of what is not supported by the government to provide you the minimum of living standards, is quite complex but non-discussed topic in the region. And one of the first issues is that, as you mentioned, a lot of people are moving, and you're talking about healthcare worker, but you can really broaden this about caregivers for older people, for example, that are working outside Africa. While here, there is no recognition of this need. What is interesting, it could be a long conversation, but what is interesting to consider, and I'm happy to talk more about that aside if you want, it's the first thing is, what does care mean in Africa? How is it recognized in the new context and in this demographic context today with an aging population? Yes, we have a young population, but the part of the population is getting old. And at policy level, we have absolutely nothing regarding standards, even considering the needs, because traditionally this is part of the unpaid care work, which is today supported by women. And there is a need to really focus this because, one, we are going to face a big issue on the continent around just care. Is it healthcare? It is care, domestic care, care for elderly. This is becoming a critical issue, not in 50 years, but in less than 20 years. We have no standard. Data exists, but are not analyzed. And this is part of the gaps I was mentioning, saying there are still some gaps to have some complementary analysis to really help to think about our future in here and make economic decisions, but also some specific social policies that are considering all these different aspects. The second, a part of the issue of who is going to take care and where is going to be the workforce for healthcare or caregiver, where are they going to be the best employed and used, is about the fact that taking care or addressing this topic would also be a good way to meet the different agendas about decent work. And this totally related what you tell about health and care labor migration. The first thing is about having our policymakers better informed about that, which means having analysis being able to being properly supported to be done and communicated. I'm very sorry for my not very good English around that. I hope I answered the questions that were quite complex. I'm sorry, Marlene.
No, thank you very much, Aissata. I think as we look at the questions, that some very complex issues are being raised, and from Isa Al-Masarwe, the Secretary General of the Jordan Higher Population Council, there's a comment that says the huge population size and demographic trends in China and India should concern every country because we all share global environment and prices of basic food items. Also from Alaka Basu, known to many of us, the DRC levels in female literacy are very high and remarkable, and historical policy or factors, what historical policy factors account for this. But I believe she had a comment about what could be the negative factors in India in the future. From Alania Larazabal, what could be the negative factors in India as it transitions to becoming an aged society in 20 years or so? And from Caroline Schmidt, says she takes a more pessimistic view of Africa because mortality is declining faster than fertility, and the region is experiencing continued population growth. So how do you meet the challenge of educating the growing number of youth and the challenge of political instability in many countries in the region? So I've touched the environment, I've touched education, I've touched aging societies, and I'm going to give both of you, Aissata and Barbara, an opportunity to pick one of these issues and have a final comment because we are running out of time. So Barbara, pick an issue. You're muted.
Thank you so much for your questions and lively engagement. I'll just pick a couple of the things that were mentioned here. Easy things first. Alaka Basu has been a longtime board member for PRB. If you look at the earlier slide that showed progress in female literacy over the course of the last 20 years, you'll see that some very substantial gains in female literacy have taken place just quite recently. So I do want to draw your attention to that, although the base in 2000 was also pretty high, I think about 63% or so. And again, that's literacy rates among 15 to 24-year-olds. So I think this question about aging is one that's really that deserves a lot more attention. It's something that we at PRB look forward to exploring, both in terms of the question that was addressed earlier about sort of we look at the demographics of the working force writ large. What we really want to do more with is looking at the demography of different occupational segments, including home care workers, nurses, and other members of the care economy. And I think that I think many planners in India are very worried about making sure that they have the kind of social safety nets in place to take care of so many elderly. If we look at countries that have gone through very rapid fertility decline, went through the demographic transition quickly, I think about countries like Turkey and Korea, China. The other side of that is rapid aging. And I know from the little that I read about sort of credit ratings and things like that, that insurers and the people who offer credit in the commercial market are paying careful attention to what provisions are in place to care for what will be rapidly aging populations in India and in some other countries. So I think I'll stop there and let Aissata take some of the other questions. I apologize I didn't get to all of them.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Marlene. I'm going to quickly try to respond to Karen Schmidt's question about the fact that I have a positive view of the chance for a demographic dividend in sub-Saharan Africa and being pessimistic around the current political instability in many countries. Well, first thing, I have a positive view about what is happening in terms of how we are now in Africa looking at what we need to decide and how we are analyzing the data, demographics, to better consider the two critical key drivers that are youth and gender equality. And I totally agree with you that there is an issue around educating the growing number of youth, providing jobs for the growing workforce, and also political instability, etc. So I have to be optimistic if I want to do my job, actually, because it would not be easy. I mentioned that discussing the usual analysis, what is being done around, education, fertility rates, talking job creation is not sufficient. There is a clear issue around infrastructure and energy that is not sufficiently discussed alongside with social issues, social policies topic, or human capital topics. The government has to provide the conditions for a conducive environment for the private sector to be able to create jobs. And this needs to be discussed around investments that are not sufficient around in energy and infrastructure. That is clear. Where I am optimistic, it's not about the democratic dividend. You might be right. Maybe all this should have started earlier. I mean, sure, it should have started earlier, but it is now that it is really this last decade really demonstrated a total mindset shift regarding how policy makers are using different tools to look at their own continent or country differently. And at the same time, what is interesting is that in doing that, there is this gradual more and more involvement of youth people. I'm not going to talk about young men, young people, those that are building their future, so that they can be part of this decision. If you know Africa, you know that being young in Africa is not that easy. You are a young man until you're 40, but you're voting since you've been 18. So this young participation, equipping young people, this young generation with the tools, but also working on bringing them into the policy dialogue spaces, for me, it's fundamental for them to really root this new governance principles that integrate youth and gender, but also to help them to see that they can be listened to. They can be listened to because they are fully fledged citizens, and that there are other solutions than violence. And you talk about instability, and I'm currently in Dakar, and I'm on phone because of riots and power cuts. So I totally know what you're talking about. But when I see all these youth advocates we are working with, helping them to be in the right political space and policy conversation spaces, is for me a concrete way to help them to become the citizen. And I just would conclude about what you are saying. For me, and this is a personal opinion, what is missing in all this conversation is that the word citizen never appear. When I was talking about mindset shifting, it's about, we are technicians. Let's talk techniques, let's talk technicity, technical, sectoral domain. But let's not forget that all this is needed to support a real democratic dialogue. And we are talking not about beneficiaries or partners. We are talking about citizens, actually. This is, for me, something that needs to be pushed forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Aissata. You've touched upon some of the issues raised in other questions, and we have run out of time for questions, but we will be looking forward to future discussions. I'll just mention that Robert Thompson raised the issue that we didn't look at urban or rural. We didn't look at rural migration to urban areas and what that means for employment and food productivity. And the question of why we're looking at continental data and comparing it to other countries. So doing more breakdowns at the national level is definitely something we can think about for the future. I really am sorry we don't have a green room session after this where we could just open it up to the audience. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do that. I want to thank our audience. Please look for our post-briefing email. We will continue the conversation in coming months. To learn more about these demographic trends and related policy in African countries, please follow Barbara Seligman and Aissata Fall and PRB on LinkedIn. URLs to their profiles are in the chat. And thank you for participating in our webinar.